Good afternoon. It's Friday the 16th of, it's Friday the 16th of December 2022, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, myself, Brian Gerrish, delighted to be here with Patrick Henningsen in the studio, and we're also joined by Alex Thompson from the Netherlands. Well, there's only one place to start, and that's war. So let's have a little listen to Boris Johnson speaking in Parliament a little while ago.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House will know that supplies of British, American and other Western equipment have been absolutely vital in helping our Ukrainian friends to protect themselves against continuing and merciless Russian attacks. And I thank him and the government for all that they have done and continue to do. Does he agree with me that we and our allies must help our Ukrainian friends not just to take out the drones and the missiles, and that means supplying them with anti-aircraft systems and fixed-wing aircraft to help shoot them down, but also to take out the launch sites of those missiles and drones by supplying the Ukrainians with the use of longer-range missile systems such as ATACMS, because that is the way truly to protect our Ukrainian friends and to bring the war to an end as soon as possible.
Mr. Speaker, without my right honourable friend's support, to me and Ukraine, none of this would have been possible, and I want to place on record my great appreciation for his support through that process. He's absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, that the Russians are taking advantage of the short-range capability of the Ukrainian armed forces by using these Iranian kamikaze drones, and as we see, against all the rules of law, including the Geneva Conventions, the mass targeting of civilian critical infrastructure is not only a war crime, but is a war crime that we must see does not go unpunished.
Well, there we are. I don't know what our viewers thought of that clip, but when I saw it, I was utterly disgusted, both with the state of Boris Johnson, but also, of course, the nonsense coming out of his mouth. He clearly didn't really understand what he was talking about, but what he was doing is pushing for more long-range weapons in order to ramp up the war against Ukraine. And what Ben Wallace then went on to say was perfectly correct. We did it. So the agenda is to get this war ramped up. Of course, Boris Johnson, one of the people instrumental in crushing the Minsk agreements to get the conflict started, and now they want to pour the weapons in.
So this is a big departure, Brian, from what the U.S. has been saying for the longest time, which was we're not going to be supplying long-range missiles to Kiev, because obviously that's going to escalate the situation beyond anyone's control at that point. It becomes a NATO versus Russia multinational conflagration, which is effectively World War III. Is that what Ben Wallace and Boris Johnson are advocating for?
That's where I think they want to go. They're certainly doing all the right steps, but take us into the conflict.
Yes, so we have this nice animated slide here, which is already animated. The Ukraine conflict. So what the Russians are saying is that the U.S., there'll be consequences if the U.S. supplies Patriot missile batteries, for instance, to defend Kiev. Okay, so that's the rhetoric, and of course the consequences arrived. We'll talk about that in just a minute. They arrived this morning at the early hours of the morning, right across in multiple cities across Ukraine. So every time there's a provocation or announcement, Russia will always respond in kind. Yeah. They're pretty predictable, Brian. They're pretty predictable in how they respond. So it should come as no surprise to anybody in the West that's advocating for a longer war.
Indeed. And of course, the other thing we've got to remember is this effectively is the claim of another super weapon, but there's only one or possibly two units going into Ukraine. So on one hand, this is nonsense, but on the other hand, Russia clearly sees it as a threat. Let's just have a little listen to what Maria Zakharova had to say about the Patriots.
The Pentagon has given the green light to drone strikes on Russian territory. Inspired by such support, Ukrainian politicians are already declaring their intention to strike at the critical infrastructure of the Moscow region. On December 13th this year, the United States announced its intention to provide Ukraine with a Patriot missile defense battery. We would like to remind you that all weapons supplied by the West to Ukraine are legitimate military targets for the Russian armed forces and will either be destroyed or captured.
So, Brian, the important thing to recognize here is that the Patriot missile system is going to be deployed. It's going to be operated by U.S. personnel. The Iron Dome, for instance, in Israel is staffed, is run, is managed out of Stuttgart, Germany, out of U.S. CENTCOM. A lot of people aren't aware of that. So that's Israel's fabled Iron Dome, which is basically a complicated array of Patriot missile batteries.
Yeah.
So basically it's the same thing that's going to happen with this system in Kiev. So for anyone to say there's not going to be U.S. personnel on the ground, it's going to be technical personnel, and it's going to be run by the Pentagon, full stop, as the Iron Dome is in Israel. So that is going to be a major escalation on the part of the United States and NATO. So they're basically going to read that. Moscow's going to respond in kind. More likely they could vaporize those batteries in a matter of minutes. Minutes, in fact, with a hypersonic missile, for instance. So what's that going to mean? Where's that going to take Europe? Where's that going to take NATO?
Deeper into the conflict. So is this the Western agenda to ramp it up? Where do we go here? A ceasefire?
Well, let's look at the comments by the Russian spokesperson, the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. And he says here, this was a press conference on Wednesday, no plans for a Christmas or New Year's Day ceasefire. And the special military operation continues. The priority is to protect the people of the DPR and the LPR. We'll show you a video clip in a minute of what's going on in Donetsk. And this is interesting comment here. The accession of Odessa and Chernigov to Russia depends on the choice of the citizens there, foreshadowing for a potential situation, a referendum, for instance, or a lot of people have been talking about an uprising in Odessa, Brian. So that's interesting. And here, in the case of the deliveries of the Patriot missile systems to Kiev, they will become a legitimate target of the Russian Federation forces, as we said. So everyone's clear about where things are right now, but this is what happened this morning. Widespread missile attacks across multiple cities here. So this is not good news, but this is basically the same old script is just being rerun over and over again.
But it's also proving that, of course, the Russians are not running out of ammunition and missiles. And in this particular attack, we've also now seeing a fall off in supplies from Ukraine's nuclear power stations, and that's a first. So another massive attack. So complete nonsense from the BBC that the Russians are running out of missile systems and ammunition.
So the big worry is that Russia's going to be mounting a major winter offensive, and of course this is probably going to happen. If you think about how aggressive Russia was last February with the hard ground and so forth during the winter, I wouldn't be surprised if that is indeed the case. But what's interesting is how the media is pivoting. This is Reuters here, and if you scroll down, interesting bit of information warfare going on. If you scroll down, you'll see a video come up from Reuters, and instead of showing civilians dead in Kiev or on the western Ukrainian side, they don't. They're showing the siege of Donetsk by Ukrainian forces and civilians being hit there. I had a lengthy interview with an international lawyer who is based in Donbass for the last couple of weeks. He confirmed that the city is under siege and civilian targets are being hit indiscriminately. Of course, Vanessa and others have echoed those same reports. So let's look at this report from Reuters. This is what ran on Reuters. And I quite frankly was surprised that they actually ran this. And to me, this shows a sea change because Reuters would not run this report showing victims on the Donbass side unless it was approved at the highest editorial level. But let's look at this report.
Ukrainian forces staged their heaviest shelling attack in years in the country's Russian-controlled east on Thursday. That's according to Moscow-installed officials there. The attacks came as both sides ruled out a Christmas truce in a war that's been raging for almost 10 months. The Russian-backed mayor of Donetsk city said 40 Ukrainian rockets were fired from Grad multiple rocket launchers in the early hours. An apartment block was damaged and a hospital where Marina works.
There was a woman lying here. Just imagine all that debris flying her way. You can see some blood here. She was taken into surgery. They sewed up and bandaged the wound on her leg.
Local resident Ludmila Butsenko sustained a head injury.
I heard a loud rumble, and I saw something like a big fireball falling right in front of the balcony. It all started coming in onto my bed. Glass, bits of bricks, all of it.
Meanwhile, Russian forces kept up shelling and airstrikes along the entire eastern front line. Fighting continues to rage largely in Ukraine's east and south, with little movement on either side. Ukrainian Army Brigadier General Alexei Gromov said Russia was digging in for a long war and still wanted to conquer the whole country.
The Kremlin realizes that in the short-term perspective, it is impossible to achieve victory in the war, thus seeking to turn the conflict into a prolonged armed confrontation aimed at exhaustion of Ukraine and our partners.
Moscow and Kiev are not currently holding talks to end Europe's biggest conflict since World War II. On Wednesday, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said a Christmas ceasefire was not on the agenda, the same day that Kiev suffered its first major drone attack in weeks. 2 administrative buildings were hit, but air defences largely repelled the attack. Russia denies deliberately attacking civilians, while Ukraine says Russian strikes constitute a war crime.
Well, interesting report. So you go from the attack on civilians to the Ukrainian military report, which is just repeated verbatim as if it's true. And there seems to be now cognitive dissonance in the Western media as to how you report this. Perhaps we could just bring Alex in here very quickly. Apologies for the voice this morning. Alex, it's getting very interesting how the Western media is having trouble reporting because events on the ground are not going in line with their predetermined narrative.
I did notice, Brian, in that Reuters voiceover that even more than usual, the voiceover script insisted that every official and every structure in the Donbass that was referred to was Russian installed, Russian backed. Mm-hmm. And this, I think, is a means of mollifying the subsequent claims that are quoted as coming from them, which are not contested as regards the number of people injured and killed by Ukrainian shelling.
Yeah, that's an act of desperation, Alex, clearly, but it very well observed, modifying the propaganda. The problem with the media is they don't have any images of Russians hitting civilian targets in Ukraine. So obviously that's why they have to show some footage, so they're showing this footage. So I think that's interesting and worth pointing out. Now, you want to know what is behind this. If you want to go down to deep geopolitics, here is General David Petraeus. He's the former head of the CIA, known to some U.S. veterans as David Betraeus. But nonetheless, here he's kind of let the cat out of the bag here when pressed on this interview with Fox Digital, and he says, caught on the hoof. And that's why the support for the Ukraine is so important, especially coming after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a mess that he helped also to create, to show that the U.S. can and will lead the world, and it has the will to do just that. So again, that has to far and away be the top priority. So there's the main thesis there. The U.S. has to keep pressing, and so that's also deep geopolitics and power politics.
So they're worried that the truth about what happened in Afghanistan, America ultimately pulling out with nothing settled, nothing changed. Now refocus on Ukraine, but trust us on Ukraine, everything will be okay. Or have I got that wrong?
No, that, and we're just going to try to set the pace geopolitically, and we don't want Russia to have the upper hand and set the pace geopolitically with Eurasia. So now, in terms of the EU, there's some squabbling going on, and this is interesting here. EU members failed to reach an agreement on new Russian sanctions. So where's the schism here? Here's the schism. This is interesting. Who's holding this up? Well, it's Poland and the Baltic states. They basically want to embargo, blockade on Russian fertilizer. So this is essential for the agricultural industry, food supplies. The rest of the EU wants sort of more reasonable regulations. They're saying that if a company is owned by a, quote, oligarch, then it shouldn't have any pass-go in any European port. So this is interesting. And this ties directly into, and by the way, this is Poland, the Baltic states, very much under the thumb of NATO, under the thumb politically of Washington, more so than France, Germany, and maybe some of the other major European countries here. But that ties directly into this. It's the Dutch farming protests that have been going on for quite a while, but have really ramped up in the last couple of weeks. What are they trying to do? To meet green targets, they're banning, trying to bring nitrogen levels down. So banning fertilizer and things like that will go directly into this agenda. This is purely the Great Reset agenda, the de-industrialization of Northern Europe, but also killing what are a long established and rich tradition of farming in a country like the Netherlands, which per square mile, per kilometer is the most productive agricultural producer in the world. Yeah. There's nobody even close. So you have to read these two things together. There's not a consensus in the EU, and we're going to see possibly further fissures along these lines very soon.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Patrick. Well, we're going to take this a bit deeper, and it's really interesting how segments of UK column news, which come together pretty quickly before as we're preparing for the news, suddenly seem to slot into each other as we deliver the news. So let's have a look at what the UK government has been up to. And what we're really starting to do here is set the scene for the fact that the meddling in Ukraine has been very deep and very widespread. So here's the UK government, UK Programme Assistance to Ukraine 2019 to 2020, and it's saying that Ukraine remains a significant priority with strategic importance for the long-term security. And if we just add a bit of this, it gets interesting, because when it talks about the projects that are being paid for by the UK government and partners, I just chose this particular one, but all of a sudden we get the National Democratic Institute crops up. Well, who are they? Well, here's the website, The Future of Observer Rights. And what you discover is that this is a US state-backed institution. So everything about it is the US state, the US government, and you're even down to the levels of ambassador circles, where you have high-level or former high-level American politicians and civil servants, as we call them, Patrick, who are operating to unleash these agendas on the ground. So if we follow on through this, of course, let's remind our audience that the BBC's pernicious little charity, BBC Media Action, has been working to manipulate the media in Ukraine for a long time. So this article is going back in time. But if we have a look at what is happening here, Tony Howson, one of the BBC Media Action team, has written an article where he's talent spotting for what will ultimately become BBC-controlled Ukrainian media mouthpieces. So if you think that the reports from Ukraine are simply from Ukrainian state media, no, because the BBC has been in there for some time. And if we follow on through here, we've got, sorry, I've advanced one slide too far. We've got a little video clip with a gentleman talking to Forces News. Now, these are reports that come out to British Armed Forces troops, the Army, Navy, Air Force, apparently giving them factual information on Ukraine. Let's have a look at this little clip and see what the gentleman concerned says.
The logic would seem to be that they're trying to take the Donetsk region, but you know, they're not exactly choosing the best places to attack. And my suspicion is that Putin has given them a directive. You do this, and then everybody then follows the directive without you know, rhyme or reason or just cause. They're just bombarding everything. They're just shelling everything. They're shelling the city, and they're shelling the surrounding area to Bakhmut. World War I trench works are there, but of course also the guys have got to defend the city area as well, which is actually, you know, which is quite challenging because it's quite a big place. So it's not a small amount of people that are in there defending. So yes, in places, it's World War One trench works where the forests are, the forests around Bakhmut and the parks and things, they're just no longer there like that. The trees are shredded. So that is World War One looking at it. It's rotten. It's horrible there. This is the post-Putin struggle actually starting already. So, the boss of Wagner Group wants to show everybody that the army's useless and his people are powerful, so that he is an important person in the post-Putin world.
So an interesting little dialogue. What does he get into? Effectively, he gets into regime change. But the key question is, who is Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Grant? Before I answer that question, Alex, what did you make of I know that was only a few seconds of delivery, but what did you make of the statements by that man?
How can we put this? Lieutenant Colonel Grant has got a slick manner about him. I'm not suggesting he's a particularly, mendacious operator, but the talking points have clearly come out of quite some reflection, and they're well coordinated with the footage. Those listening in audio only might have missed that there was a few seconds of Russian prisoners being addressed by the Wagner Group, this private military company, and being told, and there is plenty of other footage of this, we are going to offer you prisoners a chance to fight in Ukraine. And of course that supports the case of Russian desperation that's being made. It is one of the aspects at stake, and there is genuine footage of that, of prisoners being told, look, you can fight in Ukraine, and if you don't like it, we'll just execute you. I know that sounds particularly shocking to some people, but that is one of the things going on. It's not the whole picture. So he's presenting it perhaps, shall we say, in tandem with those who are making the report. It's obvious that they want to lead the questions in a certain direction towards the idea of total Russian desperation, and perhaps ignoring the idea of the operational level of warfare, in which commanders, as in the Second World War, on the Eastern Front were told this is your objective and you're largely free to achieve it with your resources.
Okay, thank you for that, Alex. Very interesting. You used the description slick. Well, I think this man is slick, and he's slick because he's not quite what he seems. So what label can we put on him? Well, let's bring in this straight away. A senior fellow of the Institute for Statecraft. And he mentioned, or it was on screen, he was a defence expert at the Baltic Security Foundation. Well, if you've never heard of that before, go and have a look at their website. It's a group of people that have come together in order to sort out Baltic strategic security with a foundation and a project. And Patrick, I'm going to say to you, can't really find out any easy detail about how this group's funded, but I don't get a warm feeling about it. This to me is deep state, almost certainly UK and the US working with others. What are your thoughts?
Oh, just one of many of a collection of a rainbow of various think tanks and organizations, which are mainly to keep certain people employed after their careers in civil service or in the military, or to prep them for media appearances and media segments, and to basically circulate talking points. Think tanks are basically the government or the deep state's version of academia. These are people who wouldn't be in academia, so they create their own academic institutions through networks of think tanks in order to promulgate ideas, and that's of course funded by either the state or by the defense industry.
Yeah, so unlikely to be independent in what it's doing and the viewpoint that it's putting across. Well, let's put up a bit more information on former Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Grant. Here's some information which you can find on the Baltic Security Foundation. So he worked as a defence and reform expert in Ukraine. He's worked for the Ukrainian Institute for the Future, Sandhurst, the Royal Naval College at Greenwich. He's worked in Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Montenegro, Moldova, Poland, Albania, Kosovo, Slovenia. So this is a 37-year course, but this man is highly politically involved. Let's just flag up some key points. So he was formerly working with the Ukraine Institute for the Future, senior fellow for the Institute of Statecraft, reformer of the Ukrainian defense housing. Now that sounds a simple thing, but actually there seems to be quite a lot of it. He's also been a reformer of the Ukrainian military, and he is rabidly anti-Russian. This comes across in his statements and his written work. He seems to really, really dislike the Russians. And he's also claimed to be founder member of the SCP political party in Latvia. And I'll just throw this one at you, Alex. I found it fascinating that this man has been cruising around the eastern states, and then he can simply decide he's going to reside in a country and start a political party. This to me does not sound possible for somebody who is simply a former army officer.
It's utterly not done in Sandhurst circles and Warminster circles where he's from, but in his adopted home of Riga, where he now lives there, and in all of those former Soviet and Soviet satellite states, it is quite normal for a military big man to found a party. Riga, of course, has been suggested by several people as the home of the Juan Guaido-style Russian government in exile, the pro-Western government in waiting. Far be it from me to suggest that there's a concrete role there for Lieutenant Colonel Grant, but if there were such plans, he would be one of the main men setting it up. And for those who are wondering about what I was saying a moment ago about the Wagner Group not being squeaky clean, there is plenty of footage. Look for Yevgeny Prigozhin, the commander of it, clearly a very unsavory character running the Wagner Group, and I think that's should we say Lieutenant Colonel Grant's nemesis in here. The two of them are, maybe making accusations at each other. Grant is suggesting that Prigozhin is in the running to mount a palace coup against Putin, which is a common talking point, not very credible to me. But there you go. No, it's quite a hot cauldron that's brewing around Lieutenant Colonel Grant's claims here. But he, as you say, he's gone right down from the Baltic to the Black Sea, turning ministries of defense against the Russians, and he's been in Chile as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, let's just remind our viewers of the really excellent work that Mike Robinson in particular did with the Integrity Initiative and a look into the deep state. So I picked up immediately that our Lieutenant Colonel Grant had been a fellow there with another deep state organisation. And if you haven't seen any of these articles, which are up on the UK Column website, please do read them to get an understanding of what we're seeing here. And the Integrity Initiative, look into the deep state here, and the Institute of Statecraft, these are where you should start off. But the whole thing gets deeper, because here is that report into poor governance and corruption in Ukraine's defense housing system. It's not simply there weren't houses, the problem is institutional corruption, and it's identified as being a massive problem. So although this was a few years ago, much of it has still not been cleared from Ukraine, and we're seeing reports of that, particularly around Odessa, which has been covered on the UK Column in the last few days. We've got here on the UK government's website, call for project proposals to support defence reforms in Ukraine. So all this is still going on. But of course, what are we talking about here in 2019? We're after people to help ramp up Ukraine's defence industry. And they're talking about one particular company here, UK Roboron-Prom. And what is this? Well, it's a vast defence manufacturer. So now we know that the British government embedding itself in this organisation in order to modernise it, in order to ramp up production for the war, which clearly the government knew was coming, the UK government knew was coming. Are we talking therefore about a war between Ukraine and Russia, or is it between the UK and NATO and Russia? I think it's the latter. You can visit this company's website and see that they're talking about the sheer scale of the company. So, Patrick, this is just so obvious, the deep state meddling of the UK and the US in order to foment this war. And of course, Merkel has now admitted that the Minsk agreements were cynically used in order to buy time, in order to get Ukraine as a proper military force to attempt what? Regime change against the Russians.
No, absolutely. What this also shows is that Ukraine has zero sovereignty as a country. Their cabinet, their leadership's handpicked by the U.S. State Department. Their defense is being run by NATO, being run by the UK, being run by the United States. So it's like on the sovereignty index, you've heard of the corruption index, right? The global corruption index. On the global sovereignty index, Ukraine is also right down there at the bottom, instead of being like they were at the top of the corruption index. So that's just not good news for the people of Ukraine. If you care about the country itself, if this keeps going, Brian, there's not going to be much of a country left.
No, and I think that the likes of Ben Wallace and Boris Johnson will be delighted because they are in the background planning this. Well, let's just come back to Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Grant. And we talked about the Ukraine Institute for the Future. So we're just going to pop that on screen. So the Institute is, of course, an independent think tank. That's remarkable, isn't it? When we think about what he has been engaged with, this claims to be an independent think tank which forecasts changes and designs possible scenarios in Ukraine. Is this helping to foment the war? I would be highly suspicious that it might be. And if we look at other people involved, we've got Viktor Andrusev here. And of course, what do you see when you look at what his skills are? Social activism and change. So we're drilling into the organizations which have been seeded in Ukraine, and it's all about changing society, activism, change, transformation, disruption. A little bit more here. We've got what I've called a premonition, the report which they're talking about back in March 2020. How can Ukraine prepare for the crisis? Well, we're to believe from this article that they were simply looking at an economic crisis, but I think the image that they've chosen gives us a good idea that what was coming was pretty dark. And it goes on. We can't dwell on it too long in today's news, but as we go through Ukraine, we can see it's now riddled with organizations. Here we've got the Ukraine Democracy Initiative. If we animate the screen a little bit, you'll see how the images come up, engaging with the most active and game-changing pro-democracy groups in Ukraine. Trust us. Let us inject Western democracy into Ukraine and you'll be safe. But of course, they admit there that it's part of a global network. And we can get into other areas. So we've got project goals. I found this interesting because a donor here is the International Renaissance Foundation. And if we have a look at the International Renaissance Foundation, it leads us very quickly through to the famous George Soros. So what are we looking at here? Alex, just very quickly for you, I'm very sure that what we're looking at here is disruption and change agents, which have now been injected by the UK and of course the US in particular, in order to take over Ukrainian society. This country is being wrecked from the inside, never mind the attacks and the warfare going on with Russia at the moment.
It is being attacked from the inside, and one of the techniques being used from London, both from Spook World and from Think Tank World, is using allied nations, particularly the rabidly anti-Russian chiefs of Latvia and neighbouring Lithuania, as allies, as stuffed shirts, really. Don't forget that recently Kit Klarenberg in the Grey Zone reported on the Kerch Strait Bridge blowing up plans that were sent around by Institute for Statecraft people, and one of the key men there, in fact, if memory serves, he was the head of the Ukrainian cluster for the Integrity Initiative some years ago, is Lithuania's first post-independence defense minister, Audrius Butkevičius, who was a key recipient of this plan and stayed around, turning Ukrainian special forces and planners into hotheads for social change. and he came straight out of the late anti-communist scene in Lithuania. So the Brits are very good, very well versed in turning people in the Baltic region into change agents for Ukraine. There's a lot of interchange between the client states of Anglo-American statecraft in that region, and the Ukrainians are sitting ducks and easy targets for such narrative spinning. They can hardly believe that people in fraternal nations would have pro-deep state Western intent.
And I might add, Alex, it's interesting how the Baltic states are now being used, much like the Balkan region has been used for centuries as a buffer zone between two great powers. And the person who's going to lose in the end, if things are to escalate, are going to be those people living in the Baltic regions and people living in Poland. But it's interesting how that buffer zone has shifted north from the old Styrian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then north now, the Baltics. Isn't it the same game, Alex?
It very much is, Pat, and there's many links between the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Adriatic regions, the 3 Seas initiative, the Intermarium plan. We've talked about it in longer format, but we don't have to just make this up ourselves. It's clear that some of the deep state aligned media is talking about the Balkans as a second front, a second Eastern Front. The Baltics would be a third Eastern Front. In population and economic terms, they are much less important than the Balkans, Ukraine, or the Caucasus. Perhaps they're being kept in reserve in military front line terms, but they're certainly at the front line of the mind war that's going on between the Russian former satellite countries, or in those countries between Russian and deep state Western interests.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Well, we'll drop another one on screen so that people can see the scale of this attack on the minds of people in Ukraine. Here we've got the Ukraine Democracy Initiative. We speak, we envision, we enact democracy for Ukraine. And don't worry, because this is a robust, non-partisan and grassroots initiative founded by a group of experienced scholars and civic activists from Australia, Ukraine and abroad. I wonder whether there's a bit of Commonwealth influence here, but it isn't only about Ukraine or even Australia, because it says later in the description, at the heart of the initiative is a dedicated global network of academics, field experts, civic activists and pro-democracy groups, policymakers and citizens concerned with the future of democracy. So this is global, it's non-partisan. We need to do more work to see who's funding this one, Patrick. But of course, this attack on Ukraine is also an attack which is being enacted on other Western countries, such as UK here, and even the US of A itself. What more can we say? Well, I just wanted to bring in this quote here, if we pop that back on screen, because this organisation says that Ukraine is the new political testing ground. So it's a testing ground for NATO, UK, US weapons, but also it's a testing ground for how the West can manipulate and control the Ukrainian public mind, which is particularly sad. I'm just going to break the heaviness of this part of the report by putting up a little cartoon clip which has been circulating on social media, but I think it says a lot in a very short space of time. Let's have a look.
Standing behind me are dozens of plaintiffs. Up there, don't jump. Dozens of plaintiffs.
Well, there we had it. Biden was doing one of his, we can't really say what was in his mind as he was talking about or telling people not to jump. But of course, behind him, Zelensky, now the utterly controlled puppet, jumping as much as possible.
I'm going to call fake news on that one, Brian. That can't have been Zelensky, of course, because he wasn't wearing the pea green Benetton T-shirt. So that had to have been edited. I don't think that's an authentic video, Brian.
I take the hit on that one, Patrick. Thank you very much for that. And this one, I think we should have another little video clip here. We're simply going to say, and of course the Western claims that Western weapon systems are going to solve the conflict, are going to win the war. A little bit of tragic footage of the famous F-35B. Let's have a look.
Oh, he just crashed. Oh, shit. Oh, shit.
Well, the tragedy of that little clip, of course, is not just the crash itself, is the fact that the pilot ejected from ground level and that chute seemed to just deploy. So I don't know what the result is, but I hope that the pilot has survived that unfortunate incident. Alex, let's bring you in here because, of course, many people are questioning what the objective of both sides in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And I think you've got an article that's recently appeared on the UK Column website.
We have indeed. Ian Davis, I think it's well known to our regular viewers now, takes, well, I think we're all even-handed, but he takes a more sceptical towards both blocs position than some of us. And there's perfectly sufficient room in UK Column analytically to discuss that. So Ian is taking a position that will not be popular here with many of our viewers, but it is well argued. And he's asking here in part one of a two-parter, who wants a multipolar world order, a phrase that most latterly has been spoken about by President Putin at the annual Valdai Speaking Club, a Russian think tank of importance. Here's just one of the things towards the end of the first part of the article that Ian says. With the prospect hanging low of effective global and monetary financial policy control over every nation on earth, it won't matter to the Bank for International Settlements and its central bank members what individual nations imagine their sovereignty to mean. He's being, I think, justly cynical here and arguing that there is a long backstory to the idea that the West could foment or foster or take advantage of trends towards a multipolar world so that it no longer has directly, which is increasingly unmanageable for it financially and culturally, no longer has directly to manage the whole world. It will just give certain fiefdoms away. And I know that this is a position not everyone is happy with. Patrick, I think, to some extent entertains this. Vanessa would be less keen on it, but we are going to continue to ask our viewers and listeners to think hard about these things, because Ian is bringing out a wealth of material pleading for the notion that really the blocs are playing for everything here. In fact, that's a term that Ian uses. It's a game for everything. I don't know whether Patrick has a thought on that, because I'm not suggesting a change in editorial policy, but we are giving Ian scope to discuss this openly.
Well, I personally don't have an editorial policy on this issue. I just look at it as objectively as I can. So, and if you study international relations, people tend to fall in different schools on that. The realist school, for instance, or liberal internationalist school. But there's other ways, of course, of analyzing this as well. So, in terms of great power politics, and a lot of people want to frame the Great Reset in terms of this Manichaean division between the people and Klaus Schwab and the elites, and the Russians are in bed with Klaus Schwab, and the Chinese are in bed with the World Economic Forum. And so a lot of people want to sort of envision how all these various teams stack up against each other. However, I think you can maybe take even a further step back from all that and look at this in terms of a long-range view of world history. And one of the X factors, of course, throughout world history has been two things: energy and technology. And as these two things develop and progress, and resources become more scarce and also become more abundant at the same time because of new technologies and things like that, that will all ultimately, I think, shape things like sovereignty, things like international relations and nation states. So it's a very complex topic, Alex, to be sure. And so certainly, yeah, there's room for lots of different ways of looking at this and a lot of different discussions to be had.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. So where are you going to take us, Alex, now?
We're off to the wonderful world of the European Parliament, Brian, that bastion of probity. And so the first slide in this segment shows one of the people who's just been arrested unprecedentedly, who's a member of that parliament, the photogenic Eva Kaili, a socialist member of the European Parliament from Greece. Not just a pretty face, she has been a TV presenter, but she's also a master's student of international relations who did a hard degree first, architecture and engineering, like David Scott. Here she is in a slightly eyebrow-raising shot, talking to Ali bin Samih al-Marri, the Qatari Labour Minister. She, at this point, was already one of the many vice presidents. There's one per political faction. One of the many vice presidents or deputy speakers of the European Parliament. This was on the last day of October this year in Qatar. She's been quite a lobbyist for Qatar, and that's what's got her into trouble. This footage is from the Belgian publication Nieuwsblad. Now, the headline here from another Belgian publication says that she was caught red-handed with a bag full of banknotes. Scandal with this among the socialists in the European Parliament. It is socialists in both Belgium and Italy who've been caught, but I'm not trying to make it party political. So we read here that Eva Kaili's domestic partner, who is a parliamentary assistant for another member of the European Parliament, an Italian one, has also been arrested. And the key kingpin here, we'll see in a moment, and a photograph of him, is Pier Antonio Panzeri, a former member of the European Parliament, who seems to have been taking a lot of money from Qataris. And that's quite an eyebrow-raising claim, but now we're talking about the Belgian federal prosecutors having a raid done on these properties in both Belgium and their counterparts in Italy, and finding 600,000 euros in cash at Panzeri's house from Qataris, allegedly. From the Greek side, Eva Kaili's father arrived in Brussels and was arrested by the Belgians, having left a hotel room where some gentlemen had just been nice enough to give him a couple of €100,000 in a suitcase, which he left in the room. There's also a former prime minister of the French-speaking part of Belgium, Marie Arena, who is also a member of the European Parliament, who had her office searched. Those who are MEPs couldn't claim immunity because they were caught red-handed with money. So they were given their European equivalent of Miranda rights and interviewed with their lawyers in detention. And the president, the Speaker of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, had to fly back from Valletta to Brussels to oversee this procedure because Antonio Tarabella Marc Tarabella, a socialist member of the European Parliament in Belgium, had his house near Liège also searched, and that gets into areas of diplomatic immunity. So if we put the slide back on, we'll see a bit more of the Belgian news graphics that have illustrated what's going on. First of all, a tweet recently from Eva Kaili. She was bigging up the UN's labour organisation, the ILO, and saying that they regarded the Qataris as some of the best performers in the Gulf in terms of human rights standards. So she was calling on the EU to enforce new laws. She was particularly keen on lobbying for the Qataris to enjoy visa-free access to the Schengen zone. So here from another Belgian quality paper, De Standaard, this infographic shows that Panzeri, no longer an MEP himself, was allegedly the kingpin, that he used his wife and daughter on the right as mules for the money that he was allegedly getting from the Qataris, hence why they were arrested. Red dots indicate where lots of banknotes were found. Yellow dots indicate where there was a house search, and blue is people associated with the European Parliament, Eva Kaili, Panzeri, Maria Arena, Tarabella. So Italians or ethnic Italians in Belgium, and in one case a Greek, and their staff quite a lot involved as well. So here is Kaili, as I say, not the least attractive of European members of Parliament, and the Telegraaf in the Netherlands has got more on this. And here is Panzeri, the alleged kingpin, who was already in 2017 had to pay 84,000 euros nearly back to the European Parliament for problems with his claims. We also have Dutch journalists, in this case Hans van Willigenburg, noticing that Eva Kaili's strange voting behavior is already being invoked as a way of distancing her from others in the European Parliament. So he's reporting that people are already saying it was funny how she turned up replacing other members of her bloc to vote on things affecting Qatar, even though she wasn't a member of the relevant committee, and that she was hiding in an area at the back of the voting room, normally reserved for underlings, not for European Parliament members. So there we are, as the Dutch journalist here from Willigenburg says, this is the Operation Damage Control coming in. Here's what the raid looked like. The Belgian Federal Police, who, because they can't agree on Belgium's national language, use English in their insignia, have shown us all these lovely stashes of cash that have been recovered from all these addresses. And a blog called Unser Mitteleuropa has gone into detail on this and noticed, time's too short to go into detail, but Eva Kaili has, as well as coming up through the ranks of her national party, the Socialist Party of Greece, PASOK, she's also been very well involved with people up to former Hungarian Prime Minister level, Gordon Bajnai, in a George Soros think tank. He had to come in somewhere, didn't he? That's just one of the angles involved here. Another Dutch journalist, Alexander Bakker, has reported that there was a commotion in the press conference the day after this in the European Commission, not the European Parliament, separate organisation of the EU, because the spokesman, according to Bakker, only allowed 2 questions to be asked by the journalist about these multiple arrests of members of the European Parliament. And he reports that Ursula von der Leyen herself decided to say more about this herself. It's pretty amazing what's gone on. The kingpin here, as I say, is Italian. There's reports of a villa having been bought for him and built for him in the Alps, and of 100,000 euros being paid by the Qataris for a family party. He is, no irony intended here, head of a charity in the swanky part of Brussels on the edge of the Parc de Bruxelles, just on the edge of the European quarter as well. And that NGO, which was reportedly raided as well, to find where the cash was stashed there, that NGO is called Fight Impunity, if you could make that up. So Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, has tweeted out a couple of images bearding the EU about this. One of them is the famous 1981 Walter Cronkite, Reagan and George H.W. Bush shot of everyone having a guffaw. And in this version of the meme by Orban, it says, and then they said the European Parliament is seriously concerned about corruption in Hungary. He's also tweeted out the stash of cash with the slogan, this is the rule of law in Brussels. This is what the rule of law in Brussels looks like. Meanwhile, the European Parliament has been coming up with answers like this. And for what lack of time, I will just put this on screen for a couple of seconds, but people can read this if they want. This is the answer that the European Commission is giving to members of the European Parliament about the concerns about COVID-19 vaccines, which is coming out in 2 parts here. This was forwarded to me by David Scott as absolute wretched nonsense, which I think is a good description of how much interest the European Parliament and the European Commission have in adverse reactions to COVID jabs while all this is going on under their noses. What about the Dutch Parliament? The Dutch National Parliament has voted, although the motion is still in a kind of hold status at the moment, has voted in a majority to threaten Serbia with the suspension of its accession to the European Parliament, European Union, I beg your pardon, because it follows its own Russian foreign policy with regard to Russia and doesn't do what the EU tells it. So the member of the Dutch National Parliament who submitted this, Jeroen van Wijngaarden, has said that Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, who's shown in the image here, is not playing ball and not on side with the sanctions against Russia. And he says that we can and we will, if necessary, stop the EU accession of Serbia until the Serbs do as they're told in their foreign policy. And a couple more in this segment from me. Here is a Dutch member of the National Parliament, Olaf Ephraim, who has been sent by, not quite a constituent because we don't have geographical constituencies here, but sent by a concerned member of the public, a letter from the leading Dutch bank, Rabobank, with the personal details blocked out, saying, you are taking out too much cash. This is a security risk. Allow us to inform you that cash is very bad and you should use cards instead. So the Dutch MP, Mr. Ephraim, is challenging Rabobank to stop this and noting wryly that sending these things on paper is not very sustainable, which is something Rabobank makes a big fuss about. Next door in Germany, the Federal Interior Minister, Nancy Faeser, has said in Parliament, in the Bundestag, as covered here by Julian Reichelt, that the Germans wish to reverse the burden of proof in administrative law so that they can get rid of anyone who's even accused of so-called right-wing extremism who works for any government structure without due process. They will have to prove their own innocence, a noted impossibility. So again, that's the rule of law in Europe getting to a fairly low ebb as all this is happening. And just one response there in Twitter by a criminal lawyer to Reichelt, having posted this, is saying this is absolute nonsense. You are inciting people with this nonsense because this is administrative law, not criminal law. And you see, he's even using the term Volksverhetzer, which is a criminal charge in Germany. So you are absolutely not to say that the European Union has double standards, which is, of course, something that you've interviewed Trevor Kitchen about just recently. And people should read the Trevor Kitchen and listen to the Trevor Kitchen interview you've put on the front page of the homepage at the moment of UK Column, because that goes right into detail on the rule of law in Europe.
Alex, thank you very much for that. Of course, on the corruption side, my mind takes me back to the Neil Kinnock era where we ended up with an admission of massive fraud and corruption inside the European Union, never properly investigated, never properly dealt with. Well, what do we say? If you like what the UK column is doing, please join us. And we encourage as many people as possible not only to join so you can join in the community and watch Extra Time, but of course if you want the UK column to expand, which is our intention, we need your financial support and help, so please don't be shy. And of course we've still got a shop stocked with lots of goodies. I will say that many people are a little bit fretful at the moment about delivery of items, but of course the UK column cannot do anything about the planned postal strikes. We would just say to you, if you want to buy something, please go ahead and do it, because that will still help the column, even though there may be a delay in delivery. And of course, if you're watching our material, please push it out on as many other sites as you can, because the aim is to spread the word. And Alex, I think you had a very nice what is this, Twitter, or is it Telegram? Not too sure what it is, but some nice comment.
This one is Twitter, and almost every day now people tag us on as UK Column on Twitter and say very nice things about us. One even recently said we were for a while their only friend. We don't want to, be God in people's lives, far from it, but it just shows that, the praise, the accolade that we keep people sane is really getting into new levels now, where we're the only people who talk sense to some before they find new friends to talk to. So Robert Graham here says, if it wasn't for UK Column News, I would never have found out that our illustrious Prime Minister said in Parliament, when questioned about injecting a suspect substance into small children, that it was safe. Does this leave Mr. Sunak open to prosecution? A worthy question, and that's one of the reasons UK Column exists, is to bring things that are on the public record to public notice when the mainstream media fail to, so that more thousands and millions of people can make their own minds up about such things.
Thank you, Alex. Well, another email that came into us this morning, which I thought was really wonderful. This is a reply that our viewer has had from Andrew Bridgen MP. So what does it say? Andrew Bridgen is saying, thank you for your kind email about my vaccine harm debate in the Chamber on Tuesday evening. This is an issue that I am extremely passionate about. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, I receive a great many emails from those who have suffered vaccine harm, and the large majority are not constituents. Simply put, I'd love to respond fully to each and every one of you, but regrettably I don't have the capacity to do so. Please be assured, though, that I do read your emails and am touched by the often heart-rending stories they contain. They spur me on in my campaign for more transparency on this vitally important issue. Once again, thank you for your kind words and support. May I take this opportunity to wish you and yours a very happy Christmas. So what a lovely email, and what does this show us? That even MPs react when they're given the right information and they're given support, because it's very difficult for them to stand up and be counted, and we should certainly praise them when they do. We've got another little email here from Heather for the UK column, and a little bit of comment about Zelensky, but then it says, thank you for all you do. Your programs are so enlightening and a brilliant contrast to mainstream media, worth every penny of your annual membership. Well, you can freeze the screen to read the rest, but we're going to say thank you very much for those comments. And I think this takes us on to you, Alex, if I remember correctly.
That's right, Brian. I have a few very brief mentions of things COVID related. Now, we don't have Debbie with us, unfortunately, at the moment, so I'll be even quicker than I would normally be on this. One viewer has asked us to highlight this. Mel, the lady who works a lot for the Office of the Patient Safety Commissioner, an institution that Debbie is never failing to bring people's attention to, has replied to a viewer who pushed the Patient Safety Commissioner a little further than the first response received from her, and has put on record that the Patient Safety Commissioner, who does not attend MHRA board meetings, but she does meet with stakeholders across the healthcare sector as part of her work to amplify the patient voice. Okay, that's her task. The Patient Safety Commissioner takes all issues raised by patients seriously, and was pleased to be able to raise the concerns around the vaccine damage payment scheme in a recent meeting with the Minister at the Department for Health and Social Care. she will continue to amplify the patient voice where appropriate in the course of future conversations she has, whether that is with the MHRA, Britain's drug regulator, or other organisations. So I think this was sent in as a way of saying, please don't let the Patient Safety Commissioner off the hook. Please politely hold her feet to the fire on this. So I hope that many more people will do likewise. With regard to Mr. Bridgen as well, there's been some confusion on social media. He has not, since he made his very stunning speech a couple of days ago in Parliament, suddenly been suspended from the House of Commons. No, rather a couple of months ago, beginning of November, so 6 weeks ago now, he was threatened with suspension by action of the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner because of supposed repeated failures to observe lobbying niceties. Although, of course, I don't think it's got to the level of him starting an anti-impunity NGO and stuffing it with cash, as we see happens in Brussels. Let's go on to more of these COVID brief mentions. The Daily Telegraph reports that an employment tribunal has thrown out opposition that was raised, an objection that was raised to healthcare staff being fired for refusing a COVID jab. I'll just put these on screen a couple of seconds each. The case was brought against Barchester Healthcare. You can see the de rigueur ridiculing of Christians or any believers really here, thinking that God will protect them from illness, although that's really the historical position of most of humanity, that God will protect you from illness. No, it's absolutely extreme now to mention such things. Judge Maidment, who threw out the case against Barchester Healthcare, said that the employer was at pains to reaffirm that there was no mandate. So he said that there was a choice. It's just a choice with consequences. A bit like the free speech argument. You can say what you like, but it will have consequences. And you can see here from the names that it is a Lithuanian here who came out with this trust in God, not in a way as to ridicule medicine, but to say that the immune system would do her good. And an Italian name is mentioned here as well. There we are. They've been thrown out. A Muslim's been targeted here as well for ridicule by the Daily Telegraph write-up. And one more has even said that I consider the vaccines to be experimental. So obviously, according to the Daily Telegraph, that's an extreme thing to say. Here we have taking an MP to task regarding the jabs. I won't read any of that. I'll just put it on screen again. But I'm keen to show that a number of people are writing to us saying, I am taking my Member of Parliament to task with regard to what's said about jabs. I am asking my MP, why weren't you in the chamber when Andrew Bridgen made his recent remarks? You can all do this if you live in Britain with your Member of Parliament or wherever you are. You can ask them, did you attend this person or remotely join the debate? If not, why not? The truth cannot be hidden or ignored anymore. In Scotland, of course, Scotland has its own parliament. One of its members is John Mason, who often baffles us really with some of the positions he takes. And David Scott forwarded this one to me. This is John Mason, MSP's lines on vaccines. He considers certain people credible in scrutinising the government as it makes decisions. So he wants all arguments about COVID and the vaccines to go over his head. He wants them to be taken up with appropriate medical and scientific authorities. No differentiation here between captured ones and unbiased and impartial ones. But then he says at the end, I am convinced, which is just another way of saying I have faith that COVID has been a threat, and I'm convinced that the vaccines have been a tremendous breakthrough enabled by God. I hope this clarifies my position. Down in New Zealand, we have covered the Baby W case, which has shocked a lot of our viewers. Now a second couple, being derided here by the New Zealand Herald as anti-vax, have said they too want unvaccinated blood for their seriously ill toddler. I would say regardless of the brutality of the temporary custodianship imposed on Baby W to make sure he got operated on with a regular pool of blood, the point has been made, and a lot of people are really starting to notice now that there may be tainted blood in the system. And here's an example of some really measured commentary coming from a social media user replying to the New Zealand Post. Oh, expletive, I'd bet that all people unvaccinated don't or have never donated blood to start with. Yes, such people exist, and yes, they do believe that seriously. Finally, from me here, Dr. Jeremy Farrar, Chief Scientist appointment at the World Health Organization, hot on the heels of the appointment of, often referred to as Stalin's nanny, of course, another British heavy hitter involved, Dr. Susan Mickey, the communist who doesn't like to be called a communist, who is a communist, and Richard Ebright, a professor at Rutgers University, chemistry and biochemistry, if I remember correctly, replies, this is a major unforced error by the World Health Organization. They do seem to be losing the plot a bit, don't they?
Well, there's a lot of encouraging material in that mix. Of course, the other side's getting more desperate, so they're becoming more obvious in their attacks on anybody who challenges the narrative. And of course, we are now starting to see some of the professionals and the MPs standing up, so that should be encouraged. I think we're kicking off here with a little video of Fauci in action.
Oh, it's just a little reminder of where the U.S. government is pressing right now for the winter with regards to the whole COVID issue. A lot of countries are starting to dial back their policies and restrictions, but the White House, unfortunately, is pushing pretty hard forward this winter. Here's Anthony Fauci, the Lord of Viruses and Pharmaceutical Products.
Here we are going into the third year of it, and we are still in the middle of a pandemic with the numbers that you just showed.
Right, so that clearly they don't want to let it go. Fauci certainly, he's retiring in a week, but he doesn't want to let it go. And so it's clear the establishment, the medical public health establishment in the UK, in the United States, the people have let it go for largely and are glad to see the back of it. But the public health mavens, the politicians, the media, they don't want to see it go. So we're still in a pandemic, apparently, according to Fauci. So if he is the god of all things public health, and that's what the high priests are saying, what are the people supposed to believe on this? Here's Joe Biden. This is what he was pushing out today, or last night. COVID cases are rising across America as folks gather for the holidays. That's why, starting today, every household can order 4 free tests to be shipped straight to their door. Now, 150 million homes, what do you think that's going to cost in terms of public spending? I don't know, by government price standards, you're probably looking at $10 or $15 billion to send out tests that are probably worth, in terms of being manufactured antigen tests, around 50p each. So, a box of Cracker Jacks costs more to manufacture than an antigen test. So this is what they're pushing. Why is the U.S. government pushing tests really hard in the winter? Why? Because without tests, you have no pandemic. It's as simple as that. If you have no pandemic, you have no emergency use authorization for vaccines and experimental pharmaceutical products. And if you don't have that emergency use authorization, the pharmaceutical companies lose their liability shield. So you can see how all of these things are absolutely connected. It's a daisy chain of fraud.
Yeah, and so this has got to be above national governments because of the globalist impact and these big corporations. Absolutely.
So it's important to contrast here, Brian, what the U.S. is doing, what the U.K. are probably still pushing, maybe not so much. But here's what China's doing. China will no longer report asymptomatic COVID cases. So they're dialing back their policies. So they're basically saying no more, they're not going to recognize asymptomatic cases, and they're not requiring mass testing anymore. So where are the cases going to come from? So the mainstream media is absolutely have got their shoes in a bind on this, tied, they're tripping over their shoelaces. So let's just look at some MSM gaslighting here. This is the mixed messaging. They don't know how to report on this now because China was the beacon of all things COVID and pandemic. So China, they're saying, it would stop reporting asymptomatic COVID-19 cases since they become impossible to track and mass testing is no longer required. Makes sense, right? Well, here's AP. Meanwhile, China has begun to see what appears to be a rapid increase in new infections. Are you seeing the mixed messaging here? It's totally confusing, raising concerns that the health system is going to be overwhelmed. Where have we heard this script before? It's an old script. And here they go to throw even more confusion. There has been little evidence of a surge in patient numbers. So this is one article, and we've seen 3 pivots right here. And then finally, it's difficult to get a clear picture of the spread. And the new reporting rules could make things even harder. No kidding. Associated Press and the mainstream media are making things pretty hard with this type of gaslighting and mixed messaging. So this is just a little masterclass, a little example of the way the media is struggling now that China is no longer pursuing a zero COVID policy.
So cognitive dissonance in the media, they can't grip the system itself.
No, they don't know. The journalists, all these journalists have made their careers out of the pandemic. They absolutely do not know how to report this now. And with Twitter basically changing hands in management, that's no longer a censorship farm for which to regulate the global discourse on this issue, which is going to be even more difficult for mainstream media people who have been used to having a total monopoly and, total discipline on this conversation.
Okay. And we've got another video, I think, about children and vaccines.
This is a propaganda video I think people should see. This is taking propaganda to another level. We've shown a lot of disturbing videos on UK Column News over the years, especially with regards to the pandemic. I think this, in my opinion, is probably one of the most disturbing, not only because they're using child actors here, but the lies that they're making these children push and how the narrative is so twisted now. And you can probably pick it up, those of you who are au fait with this type of material, you'll pick up the propaganda hypocrisy straight away when you watch this, but we'll go ahead and roll this.
In 2020, scientists developed life-saving COVID-19 vaccines in record-breaking time. It was miraculous. It saved the lives of my parents and grandparents. In just a few months, nearly everybody in my country got the vaccine.
I lost my mother right at the start of the pandemic. So many doctors and nurses got sick. School closed down. But then came the vaccine.
You said life would return to normal. You restored our hope.
And you promised you wouldn't stop there. You said you'd help other countries. You promised to share vaccines with the whole world.
To make sure it ended everywhere, for everyone.
But you took too long.
You brought up supplies and held them back.
Just in case.
You let people in other countries suffer. Doctors and nurses kept getting sick.
Teachers died. You let the virus carry on, going round and round and round. You changed into even more dangerous variants.
Then it all came back. Again, again, again. Schools closed. Again.
Life kept getting turned upside down. For all of us. Things could have worked out so differently.
You knew that no one is safe.
Until everyone's safe.
Well, my opinion is horrific.
Cynical, beyond belief. So there's a couple of just blatant lies there that should be flagged. One of them is life-saving vaccines. I challenge any scientist to show that, to prove that even, I know this is going to sound like a stretch to Brian, to you and maybe to others, but show some scientific proof that these vaccines saved any lives. I'd like to see it. I personally have not seen it yet. There's people who have made this allegation, but I do not see any scientific backing to that. And they're getting the kids to give a guilt trip to people in the West that the global South was denied vaccines. And Africa suffered and Africans died because they didn't get enough jabs from Pfizer and Moderna. Listen, Africa skipped the pandemic. They skipped it, they didn't do the mass testing, they didn't go into wild hysteria, and they didn't go crazy on the experimental jabs. And guess what? No big problems in Africa with regards to vaccine injuries, deaths, or COVID deaths, or anything like that. They just opted out of the pandemic.
But we don't want to talk about that.
No, you're not allowed to talk about that, but luckily we are. So they didn't suffer. UNICEF is just really gone below the belt here and beyond the pale.
Desperation, I think. Well, we are getting very close to time here. We've got some tremendous content in this news, but the clock has got the better of us. I just wanted to end with this little section on the trans agenda. You've got a few slides here, Pat, and also Alex. So let's just go through those because these are pretty astonishing.
Sure. Well, the most important thing that everyone needs to know is that while you were sleeping last night, the Cambridge Dictionary changed the definition of what is a woman. So now, henceforward, according to the great and the good at the Cambridge Dictionary, a woman is an adult who lives and identifies as a female, though they may not have
may have been
said to have been a different sex at birth. You think we're joking, don't you? You think we're having it on. This is not a mem. This is real. So they, and I love the fact that they changed the pronoun from her to they. So that's the Cambridge. So the corruption of language has really reached an absolute pinnacle here.
And as you try and read it, you are demonstrating the problems, because you're looking at it and saying this can't be real. So you're having trouble reading it, and then the words themselves are causing you trouble. This is applied psychology. It's particularly vicious. Carry on through.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add, anybody who's not standing up and protesting this right now, and any politician that's not calling this out, even on the floor of the House of Commons, you really have a lot to answer for, because this is just ridiculous. And look at this here. So the woke definition of woman as the identity puts women and girls at risk. So this is editor-in-chief there, the post-millennial Libby Edmonds interview here with Jack Posobiec. She's made the important point here. What is this really about? This is because feminists have been coerced into believing this nonsensical lie. Liberal feminists have been totally bludgeoned by their own compassion and coerced into stating that men can be women and that men can be lesbians, okay? So how far does this go? I'll tell you how far it goes. If you want to go to the cutting edge of this issue, go to Norway. Look at the Nordic model. Here's Scandinavia. A Norwegian actress here faces a 3-year prison sentence for saying that men cannot be lesbians. This is one of the harshest pieces of legislation in the world right now with regards to misgendering or using the wrong pronouns or denying that trans women are actually women. You can go to prison in Norway. I kid you not, and they are arresting people. People have been canceled. This is beyond canceling. They're actually wanting to throw people in prison for it. So this is a really brutal regime in Norway, and I dare say, how long till this spreads through Europe and maybe here?
If we allow it. So Alex, very quickly, can you give us a glimpse of good news in this direction?
I can. First, I'll just plug two interviews, an interview and a blog, also on the front page. There's a glut of good material. They will help answer what Patrick has just raised. One is look to Scotland as a mirror of what's happening in Norway. So David Scott has interviewed Richard Lucas of the Scottish Family Party, talking about the legislative coercion of people in matters of sexuality. Some great insights there. And also in the comment section near the base of the homepage, near the bottom, there is an excellent German author, Johannes Eisleben, writing about the crisis of Western political systems and whether it's war in Ukraine or fear of viruses or sexual nonsense in our heads. He describes very well why this chaos is necessary for those in charge of us. But here we are. This is a piece from The Guardian together with some response from, I have to say, a Cambridge graduate like myself, predating the androgynous dictionary era. We spoke proper English at Cambridge in our day, but here we are. The Guardian is signalling a change. So actually it's The Observer, because Sonia Soda is the chief leader writer for The Guardian's allied Sunday title, The Observer, the oldest English-speaking Sunday paper, actually. And Sonia Soda of The Observer, online branded as The Guardian, says that Nicola Sturgeon, I nearly said Mrs., very bad of me, Ms. Sturgeon must take heed of changing views on the treatment of gender dysphoria. So here we are. Here's very quickly interspersed with quotations from the article, my Cambridge friend's response here. So instead of reading verbatim, it's look at Katie Dolatovsky, a Scottish male sex offender who assaulted 2 very young girls and then assumed the identity of a woman. And the Cambridge responder says, oh, so we must pass over in silence the case of male rapists who've already been able to secure transfer to women's prisons. And I see Dolatovsky is still being called a she. So the very mention, he says, of the Dolatovsky case is a momentous shift. The very mention that there might be the slightest smidgen of a hint of a problem with men in women's prisons or refugees was previously bigotry of the highest order, and those who mentioned it were unpeopled as trans exclusionary radical feminists or TERFs. Another concern, says Sonia Soda, is that children could change their legal sex, 16 and above. And we read here about mermaids and other campaigning charities. But the Cambridge Reviewer of this, that's from the article as well. The Cambridge Reviewer, responding to this, says, before this paragraph was included in the Observer recently, it was a shortcut to cancellation to mention such things, and it might even have the police on your door for transphobia. So there is a shift here. Instead of reading what's on the screen here, I'll summarize. The idea is that public authorities are now being told through the leader writers like Sonia Soda, you silly people, you shouldn't just take people's word for it that they now feel that they're a woman. You should have protected other women. There's a case in Essex University in which this was upheld. You don't just say, oh, okay, you feel like a woman, so go to the women's toilets. No, you should protect the, dare I say, real women. By actually saying, no, first of all, you have to get a legal declaration of this. This argument is now being trotted out in the bien-pensant rags like the Observer. So my Cambridge friend says, what does this indicate? It looks as if the party, in the Orwellian sense, has declared that collectivization may possibly have some problems, or that Deng Xiaoping was not altogether a filthy capitalist roader. Have they recognized that the female electorate has simply had enough of the trans agenda and that they must back off a bit? Well, seeing how much fight there is in the feminists of the old kind, I think that's a fair assessment. And if this is the blowing of the shofar on the trans movement, so that those who now know will return to base and shut down their operations, then what is next? What is the next agenda? A very good question there in closing.
It is, Alex. Thank you very much for that. And I think the proportion of this material that comes into the UK column news shows us the perilous position we're in as this attack on our minds takes place. We've run out of time for the news. Just let's end with some black humour, really, about life around us. What have you got?
Yes, and I've just shut down my slide advancing app, so you'll have to go through these while I speak to them. So first meme is old Dr. Fauci, I am the science. He actually did say that, by the way. New Dr. Fauci on deposition before Congress says, I don't recall, it doesn't ring a bell, I didn't understand and I can't remember, while sucking his glasses frame. On to the next one. There we are, just a couple of examples of the fact checkers not checking the facts. They used to say there's no evidence for mRNA vaccines causing blood clots. That's been revised. They used to say there's no link found so far between menstrual disorders and COVID vaccines, according to the EU. Now they're saying the EU regulator recommends adding heavy periods to the side effects of the shots. Finally, Reuters fact checkers used to say that the US Centers for Disease Control saw no link between heart inflammation and COVID vaccines. Now they say the US FDA is adding warnings about a rare heart inflammation to Pfizer and Moderna COVID vaccines.
Pretty
the next one, I think.
Okay.
Europe's loud rule-making unvaccinated minority are falling out of society, says CNN. That's a picture of European plebs who aren't allowed to object. But if you tap that once more, you will see that in China, we've covered this a bit before, they are utter heroes. So CNN's editorializing in China is at the heart of China's protests against zero COVID. Young people cry for freedom. My final and finally is from the Northwest Arkansas Democrat, the kind of redneck title that the Europeans love to snigger at. And here is a big fat man labeled European Union, perhaps with his rule of law brief behind him, talking to a starving third world baby and saying, well, we know there's a critical food shortage, so we're closing 3,000 farms in the Netherlands to cut carbon emissions. It's actually for nitrous oxide emissions, meaning some of you folks will have to hurry up and die to save the planet. And if you tap that once more, the people who tweeted that said, this is a Dutch tweeter saying the minister who brought this in the Netherlands, Caroline van der Plas, the European Parliament, members of the Dutch National Parliament, many people worldwide will die because you're expropriating at least 3,000 Dutch farms. I support the farmers.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much for that. That brings us to the end of today's news. Patrick, thank you for joining me. A big thank you to Mike Robinson, who stayed the course to make this news today possible. Unfortunately, we aren't able to give you an extra time today. We hope normal service will be resumed on Monday, so please join us then. And we'll end by saying once again a really big thank you to everybody, whether you're in UK or worldwide, who's supporting UK Column, because we can only do what we do with your support and help. Thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.